actually thanking Rajshri for this incredible invitation. This is really the first time that I'm going to be speaking about my projects in Mumbai. Those of you who know me know I speak about everything but my work here, and this self-imposed sanction I break now. And I've been perverse to myself by saying, even in the curated projects that I've selected here, they're the most difficult ones. And why have I done that? I've done that because the idea here of whether design matters was really haunting me. And I began to think that, yes, we can celebrate design, we can show off the utopias we engage with, but it's the dystopia that we don't address. And I think someone talked about, are there government people here? What about policy? How can we change the public sphere? So I thought, let me take the most difficult projects and see whether design, or they can show us if design matters. Because I think architects and designers in India are now dealing really with a gamut of social, cultural, economic phenomena that are molding the built environment at startlingly phenomenal rates, And in the process, I believe the architect and designers are becoming sort of marginalized within the conventional praxis. The profession doesn't engage with broader landscapes, but rather chooses to operate with the specificity of a site, a product, a particular, it's almost myopia that's setting in. And I'm saying this being part of the profession to be self-reflective and to also be critical, because I think we can't just celebrate our achievements, we have to see where we don't respond. And I think this idea that we can actually influence the mainstream is worth discussing. Because yes, we can, we can recluse ourselves, we can create beautiful things, but how do you begin to shift the mainstream? It might not sound that ambitious, but I think it's worth it. And our work sort of goes through the whole gamut. We also do projects like weekend homes, which begin to edge on indulgence and luxury. We do projects that have autonomy with very, very enlightened clients. But I said, let's leave all that aside and take the 6 difficult projects. And our approach has been working and using Mumbai, that is the city we operate in, as a generator of practice, as a source, in a sense, of nourishment. And I think it is from this more elastic definition of the profession that one sees multiple disciplines as being simultaneously valid in engaging in what I call this kinetic urban landscapes of cities and peripheries and urban regions. And so how do we go beyond the indulgences of design and begin to address broader sets of questions? And how do we use architecture, specifically because I'm an architect, as an instrument to resist the polarized conditions in our city? In short, give expression to the pluralism. I think Rajiv Sethi alluded to the future of India depending on this kind of pluralism. So the pluralism requires us to simultaneously accept the validity of differences. And it's this duality that so vividly characterizes the landscape that we work in. And so how do we engage as designers, and especially as architects, in this particular situation? So I'm going to divide this lecture into 2 parts. The first, I'm going to share with you my readings and observations of this place that has influenced me. And then in the second part, I'm going to show you 6 projects across a whole gamut, from private clients to NGOs to the government. Very difficult situations, some of which I will accept the failures that we sort of engaged with. So this wonderful image of Jahangir Sohrabji captures, I think, the spirit of Mumbai, the Ganesh Chaturthi immersions. And a city like Mumbai, which sort of added 3 million people a decade for 3 decades, becomes necessarily an elastic space, because no one can respond to such rapid change. It's totally unprecedented in history. And this sort of creates a very, very particular kind of landscape, which, it creates a duality. And I think we create binaries in the way we describe these situations, with the formal city, the informal city. And I believe for designers, these dualities are not helpful at all. You have to blur these, because it's from a third space that emanates another kind of nourishment and a sensitivity that I think we would get much more out of, one that would engage the societies we respond to in much, much more interesting work. So what is the intelligence of this kind of kinetic city? And, of course, it creates a certain kind of landscape. And like several cities in India and perhaps around the world in this post-industrial scenario, it's resulted in a new system of fragmentation of services and production locations. And it's resulted in what you might call a bazaar urbanism, which has woven its presence right across the landscape. And it's an urbanism that's created outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state, so to speak, in what Ravi Sundaram, I think, refers beautifully to as a pirate modernity that slips under the law of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. The visual culture that it constructs is just by default. And this phenomena is actually critical to the city being connected to the global economy. However, the spaces that it creates have largely been excluded from the cultural discourse on globalization, which really focuses on the elite domains of production in the city. And it's not really the city of the poor. While you get these extreme sort of dualities, which are really mind-boggling if you look at them, it's not just the city of the poor or the formal, informal, the regular binaries that are used to explain South America, Africa, but it's a kinetic space, a space where these models collapse into a singular entity, in space where meanings are shifting and blurred. And it is to this space, the space of the kinetic city, that I believe we should focus our attention. So the kinetic city is not perceived by architecture or cohesive urban design gestures, but spaces which hold associative values and are really supportive of lives. Patterns of occupation determine its form and perception. It's an indigenous urbanism that has a particular local logic, and it's not necessarily the city of the poor as most images might suggest. Rather, it's a temporal articulation and occupation of space, which not only creates a richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in dense urban conditions. And so, of course, elasticity, incrementalism, appropriation characterize this kind of city. Wonderful diagram called the 5 stages of squatting. Our city is made through this kind of logic where people slowly become part of the landscape. And of course, it creates an elasticity, for example, with open space, and that is to scale. So you can even see between Delhi and Mumbai, and the diagram that shows Mumbai and that statistics includes the parking sort of islands in the city. So we're kind of really desperate. And there's a fragmentation into scale with Manhattan, where our open spaces are not even consolidated. And of course, it results in another kind of intelligence. And so this beautiful cricket maidan, this beautiful game that, this what we call the Indian game that was invented by the British. These maidans are used for cricket in the evenings. In certain seasons, they're used for weddings. You can see that the pitch is sacred, so no one touches it. The kitchen serves samosas to the club members as well as to the wedding. And by the morning, it sort of disappears. And for festivals, the same things happen. Streets get appropriated. And entire structures are built, which create a whole new sort of sensibility. And the town hall is a fantastic example, which, as you know, there was a tradition that the British governor spoke to the citizens here on once a year. And when we became independent, much like, Animal Farm, when the pigs took over the master's house, our governor began to also give a speech to the citizens. But the date they had to do the speech was the 15th of August, middle of the monsoon, would get wet walking up the steps. So how do you take him up there? The Public Works Department is very imaginative, so what they do is basically wrap the building up. The conservationists in the street, the conservationists in the city go berserk because it's a grade 1 building, but it's wonderful because it reappropriates a colonial symbol. It's reversible, so even UNESCO won't object from a conservation perspective, and the next morning it's back to normal. So these are, I think, some examples of the kinetic city. I can go on and on. One has been researching this. But essentially what happens is it presents a compelling vision that potentially allows us to better understand the blurred lines of contemporary urbanism and the changing role of people and spaces in urban society. These don't necessarily lie in the formal production of architecture, but often actually challenge it. Here, the idea of the city is an elastic condition, not grand vision, but grand adjustment. And this is a big difference, that the city has the ability of elasticity to expand and contract with temporality as an instrument. And we don't lock ourselves into permanent solutions. And there's a whole sustainability question here and set of values that we could tease out and articulate. And the reason I'm sort of actually spending time on this, is that I think we have to change the narratives about how we look at our cities. So we begin to borrow narratives from the West which are not relevant. And I think there's great potential to extract, articulate, and I think this has been another failure of the profession. So if you look at, for example, many other aspects of this collapsing, blurring, where the simultaneous validity of two different kinds of instruments come together in a synthesis. You have, for example, the Dabbawalas, which is one of the things that we've been very proud of and celebrated. But this is an amazing example of a network that creates a synergy that depends on mutual integration without the obsession of formalized structures. And so an informal service of the Dabbawalas delivering lunch, and I don't want to go into the details of this, leverages a formal piece of infrastructure, which is the railway station, and creates an amazing synergy to create a service that's become so much integral to the culture, the eating habits and food habits of the city. Or for example, the visual culture that emanates from this, which Procter & Gamble invented, which is the sachets, which is incrementalism at its best, that a worker can't afford a bottle of shampoo because it's a whole month's salary, but a little sachet opens up a market of billions. Bottom of the Pyramid is a book that describes this brilliantly. But from that comes not only a culture, but a whole economy. Architects don't recognize this. Planners don't recognize. Incrementalism is not part of the debate, but it would be a really robust instrument. Corporations have figured it out. McDonald's does home delivery in Mumbai. It is a complete inversion of the fundamental idea on which McDonald's was founded, which was drive-in. And they've reversed the whole thing to create an amazing economy as a result. And so I think these are some of the examples. And then, of course, what happens is how does this get celebrated? Where, you know, the Kinetic City then, in a sense, bazaar-like in its form, it can be seen as the symbolic image of the emerging urban Indian conditions, the processions, weddings, hawkers, street vendors, slum dwellers. They all create an ever-transforming streetscape, a city in constant motion, where the very physical fabric is characterized by this kinetic quality. The static city, on the other hand, depends on architecture for its representation, and it's no longer the single image by which the city is read. Thus, architecture is not the spectacle, nor does it even comprise a single dominant image of the city. In contrast, festivals, Diwali, Dasera, Navratri, Muharram, Durga Puja, Ganesh, many more have emerged as the spectacle of the Kinetic City, and their presence on the everyday landscape pervades and dominates the popular visual culture of Indian cities. And this great festival, when of course immersion on the last day, where the appropriation of the static city is part of that whole process, it becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. As the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain public memory as static or permanent entities. The city and its architecture, therefore, don't even hold the same meaning and cannot be contained in a single meaning. Within the Kinetic City, meanings are not stable. Spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. The Kinetic City recycles the static city to create a new spectacle. The other extreme of this is what I call the cities of impatient capital, which is what's happening all over the world. When we celebrate Dubai, Shanghai, these are thin places. They are about impatient capital that needs to realize itself quickly. They are brittle urban forms. They are disasters. Look at what's happened to Dubai. And this represents that sort of extreme. And of course, we have this in a very uncomfortable condition. So I'm not celebrating this on counts. I'm just saying there's a way we could change the narrative to look at this, because when you come to housing, the disruptions, and you see these dualities coexist, and of course, through design, through planning, how can we blur it? Because this is disruptive. I mean, housing is a huge problem. I don't know what the solutions are, but I think a new sensibility can be sort of put into place through the profession's sort of own engagement to address these issues. Because what is happening is impatient capital is bullying us. This is about muscular, impatient capital that is determining the form of our cities. It's sort of disastrous for the poor, and it is not going to be a sustainable condition. And of course, it creates its own views which are about detachment. Global capital is never rooted. It is impatient capital that can appear and leave us when they want to. And so, how do you design for this condition? Can these complex relationships really intersect in new ways and spatially create conditions and meanings that are ever shifting? The way public space is occupied and made elastic, is that even possible? Can we sanitize the city without modernizing it, or rather modernize it without sanitizing it? I mean, these are complex questions. And most importantly, can borders be constructed and softened and boundaries be dissipated spatially? And I think this is where architecture can play a role, because the thing about architecture is that it creates very hard boundaries. It is the manifestation of polarities that exist in society, and it has huge potential to soften these polarities. And I think that is a space that we have to engage with as designers. And therefore, could this then become the basis for a rational discussion about coexistence? Or is the emergent urbanism inherently paradoxical, where the coexistence of these differing forms of urbanism, their particular states of utopia and dystopia, be inevitable? And I think this is really an important thing, because I don't believe, and I'm not trying to say the kinetic city, it obviously cannot be seen as a design tool, rather a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, ambiguous enough to allow this kind of kinetic quality to flourish. So it might be the tactical approach to take when dealing with urbanisms of temporary, of high densities, of high intensities. So I think for me that really is the reading. And I'm going to jump into these 6 projects, 3 of which are what I call global programs. Because global programs like IT centers or corporate offices, I think these are about capital that wants to isolate itself, it wants to create a hard boundary. And the challenge there becomes, how do you localize these global programs? Because by localizing global programs, you root them in a place, they can be more sustainable, they can be more engaging. Then you have local programs, and we often tend to caricature these, you know, village for craftsmen. We make it like a village. Actually, this is detrimental, because the blurring of these polarities is what we have to engage with. So if you can globalize local programs, then they resonate much more broadly, even for universal appeal. So I'm going to take you through 6 projects which I've done over 20 years. One hasn't spoken about one's work, and so a lot of this hasn't been presented or even published. The first project was done 20 years ago in Coimbatore, where I first met Rajshri. And this is the Lakshmi Machine Works Machine Tool Company's corporate office. And their brief was very clear. They said they had a company from Australia that was going to get the curtain glazing. That's the site, the top diagram. They said, we want a garden in the front and a park at the back. I mean, I kind of was like, I said, what a way to start a practice. And so when we started talking to them, we realized we could better express their project through a completely different form. And so the building that was proposed was around 3 courtyards, not higher than 2 floors, which sort of met with the kind of height of everything around it, but also could be naturally ventilated and all of that. And so it became a kind of different expression of what might be a corporate headquarters. You could move through the building more easily. It had a sequence of spaces which were humidified through water bodies. It was very easy from the street. It wasn't this sort of big reflective box. As you entered it, spaces unfolded. You heard the sound of water. You saw green. You kind of got the green in this telescopic form through the 3 courtyards. And as you went into the building, it got more intimate. And at some point, Rajiv Sethi came on board, and we began collaborating. And my first brief to him was that I don't want paintings on the wall. Let's start designing building elements. And he was very excited. And this was done in 94 to 96. And we got a whole lot of artists involved in designing building elements. So this was a bench Rajiv Sethi designed himself for meetings, because there were no corridors. It was only verandas for circulation. 6 companies occupied this within the larger identity of this corporation. And as you went into the building, it got more intimate. It almost got to the scale of a house where the family that ran it could sit. Manjeet Bawa was one of the artists, and he translated for the first time his 2-dimensional paintings into 3-dimensional embossings for railings on the bridge, on the staircases, etc. And he did a whole range of figures that he developed, which were embossed in copper. We recycled the granite to make the waterfall, so there's a whole recycling project embedded in that. Rajiv Sethi did this 104 Lakshmis, which were embossed on this stainless steel flag, which created the main entrance. And then with Yogesh Raval and with Rajiv Sethi, we said we should create a new, because this is a building that's completely naturally ventilated, we said we should create a new sort of expression for the Mughal Jali. And so what we did was we went into their machine tool plants and took all the scrap metal and recycled it into about 30 screens. And the density of screen depended on where it was situated and what levels of privacy you needed. And this was the scrap metal that came out, and a whole vocabulary was sort of developed using the scrap metal, which was material of the company, material that gave the company wealth. And this is an end portal. This next project, and this is not what we designed, but so this is the World Trade Center in Jaipur. And in Jaipur, which becomes 45 degrees, you can fry an egg here. And to have a glass box like this is just madness. So we were asked by Hewlett-Packard, HP, California, to design part of their Bangalore campus. So this was about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And you see, that's the landscape with Infosys, and they already had 3 buildings on their campus. And all these buildings are pretty typical. They're glass boxes, and they isolate groups of about 800 people. So they're antisocial, besides being totally unsustainable. And so in analyzing the existing buildings, we realized that there was a core of common facilities which were social, copying machines, coffee centers, cafeterias, etc. And then the yellow is where the software stuff happens, which needs air conditioning. So we kind of strung it all along a street, and only what's yellow there is air conditioning. So we reduced the air conditioning, and a huge amount, but just by reconfiguring. One of the things that I get upset about is when people call buildings intelligent buildings. And what do they mean by intelligent buildings is after you've designed a massive problem for yourself, you use technology to design yourself out of that problem. So we began to look at this, and of course the client wanted a LEED certificate and stuff. And because we made the building totally naturally ventilated, they won't even listen to us, LEEDs. So we kind of actually came up with this plan, and everything in gray is non-air conditioned, and everything in light gray is air conditioned, which is conference rooms and where the transformers are and all that kind of stuff. And 200 square feet per ton is business as usual for air conditioning. 290 is you can get a LEED certificate. We did 705 square feet per ton, but by no mechanical or chemical mixes, but by just saying we don't need to air condition half the space. So now that doesn't account for intelligence. So, we've got a problem with the narratives we are working with. And so you begin to get a different kind of architecture, not a glass box. This is the conference rooms. That's what they feel like from inside. You walk through these big cantilevered spaces. The circulation is all natural light and air with triple height spaces, double height spaces. So you have a changing ambiance. I think for the young people who work, there are 5,000 of them who work there. It's a completely social space because they now meet each other as they walk to the different food courts. And you begin to get a completely different set of textures, light, changing light, and sensibility, essentially. Those are the food courts. They're completely naturally ventilated. And they have niches, they have a different sequence of spaces which you can enjoy. And between the software blocks, there are courtyards with bamboos and pergolas, so you don't have to have glass boxes. Because I also notice people spend a lot on these glass boxes and then spend even more on blinds to cut out the glare to the computer. So that seemed totally ridiculous. So this became a solution which I think worked quite well. We were then asked to design an infrastructure building in Hyderabad, in Cyberabad, which is also hot and dry. And in analyzing Hyderabad, I was really intrigued by this. Because of the Telangana situation, these glass boxes have become ideal places for people to throw stones when they riot. So, they're like asking for trouble. So now when the vendors sell you curtain glazing, they have beautiful stainless details, stainless steel hooks and details for fishing nets which go with the windows so that people can't break the glass with stone. So that's become a whole new vocabulary. So we said, let that go apart. But what really influenced us was this for the building. This is a hut. In Jaipur, in many places, governments put these huts up. And that kettle serves you water. It's free of charge. And this is this guy comes to work every day and he goes and sits in it. And when the kettle comes out, he's open for business. And people come by and they drink water. It's very cold water, actually it's cool water. It's clean water. And the hut is thatch. By evaporation, he keeps the hut cool. And so he comes out once in a while and sprays some water on it, just a tumbler full, so it's not even hosing it down or anything. And he goes back in and continues serving water. Very efficient, very sustainable. And we said, how could we translate this principle into a building? And then, of course, there are these pots, which are matkas made out of earth, which are porous in a sense through evaporation. Again, they cool the water. So it's wonderful, and people enjoy this lovely cool water. So we came up with a building which was this, which is we translated that in an interesting way into 5 floors. So you have a spec building, but then you have a garden that's vertical, which is not stuck on the wall, but it's actually a screen which has a misting system in it, which can be periodically used to cool the water. And then you can have 4 different facades with different gardens and different flowers. And it's very simple. It's a hand-cast aluminum trellis, which I'll show you in a second, a regular spec building, which is very inexpensive, and then a garden that goes on top of it, and a whole series of species that could work. And it essentially sits on a podium with a parking under it, water bodies, and you get a garden above it, and it folds on the terrace, so they don't have to hire 5-star hotels for receptions. They have a wonderful space right there. And that's what it sort of looks like. In section, it has courtyards which ventilate the air. So it's also got that intelligence of convection currents within it. And you begin to get spaces which have departments that sort of can be spatially, in a sense, organized. And so that's what it looks like with the trellis after it was built. And we designed the trellis such that even if the plants didn't grow, it would be fine. The trellis is made in a little factory because, again, we said, again, talking about the impatience of capital, of course, they would need the building to be done quickly. So we did the building, and the trellis took 2 years to make, and the garden took another year to make, because that didn't hold up capital realizing itself. And so one can actually, you can step back a minute to deconstruct this and come up with a solution which I think is more interesting without becoming subservient to the impatience of capital per se. And this was made in a small little factory. 20 people were employed. It took 2 years to do. It was handmade, and it was cast in sand, so the texture of the sand could be maintained, because we very much wanted that. And that's with the misting system. You can see the principle of how it sort of grows. And this was made using these 20 people, because we were very keen that we also challenge this idea that products are mass-produced. You could use new products like aluminium, which we use, but bring employment to interface with it. So it's not, craft is not only about wood and stone and all the conventional things, but how we challenge ourselves in using this. So one mold was made for the entire project, and therefore that slowed it down, but it didn't matter, because you got, I think, eventually an interesting element. And it was all sort of handmade. This was a large anodizing tank which we set up in this small factory. And as panels were ready, they went in small shipments to the site, which wasn't very far. And they got assembled, one bit at a time. But it also engaged people. And that's how it works when you mist it on a hot summer day. And you can actually set the misting in different zones, depending on where you feel the heat. And it creates a really refreshing effect. But not only that, it cools the buildings. The building itself cleans the plants, and it's all collected in this channel and sort of recycled. So you can create a cloud around the building if you choose to, or you could create a monsoon sort of feeling around it if you choose to in the summer. And now the flowers are beginning to blossom, and different zones have different species. You can see them bloom at different times. And there's a catwalk with hydroponic trays, so there's very little water used, where gardeners can actually walk. And this, for me, was a very important process, because when we talk about sustainability, unless the social is material in part of our discussions, we are not talking about sustainability. And here, in the CEO watches his gardeners work. In a conventional building, the gardeners see a CEO driving in a Mercedes, going up, and not even interfacing with people. And here, essentially what happens is the gardeners know the CEO knows the gardeners. There's an incredible synergy, but this penetration of people who are ordinary, who are subservient in their roles in the way we define our society, sometimes brutally, suddenly have access. And this is what I mean by softening the threshold, using architecture as a way of doing that. So then how do you globalize local programs? And I'll show you 3 quick projects quickly. So this is for Magic Bus, which was slum children. They have a network where they take children to a campus to give them recreation, expose them to good food. So it's a series of pavilions on a campus, and it's called Magic Bus because they have these red buses that take students there, children there. So we created a series of pavilions in a landscape very loosely. But the constraint we set ourselves as a research project was that we would use materials only that exist in the slums and reconfigure them in more sophisticated ways for these children, because we felt that, or at least that was an ambition which one can argue is silly, but I just felt that I don't think slums are going to go away overnight. I think there's going to be a whole generation that will go through them. And I think for kids who are 8 and 9 and 10 to see the same materials they're familiar with, reconfigure them as they repair their houses when they enter their teens, could be a way that the building might speak to them. At least that was the ambition. Sometimes you just have to be ambitious to keep ourselves going. And we furthermore took the types, that means the dining hall, or the dormitories, or the administration building, and we imagined them as being types that can be retrofitted in the slums itself. So the dining hall could become a big public toilet with a community center, or the dormitory could become a toilet in a school. And in Photoshop, we would take the buildings and actually show how they actually fit into these slums. And then we started working with NGOs to see how we might do that. And very simple materials. This is the dormitory, that's the dining hall, just cement floors, steel. And you see the other dormitories in the background. The dormitories are modular, so they can accommodate a lot of people. Very light, simple construction, cladding. Again, the materials are all materials you would see in slums, but not recognize them because they're configured completely differently. And this becomes a sort of bridge, the administrative building, so the terraces get used by just taking the roof over. Little simple gestures which are not in the program, but expand space in humongously beautiful ways. And then imagining how they would sit in the slums. And that led us to working with Spark and with Joachim, who is the National Slum Dwellers Federation president. And the World Bank is building 300 or 400 toilets. They have terrible specs, concrete and this, that, and the other. But let's say we are stuck with the specs. So we approached Sheila Patel and Joachim, and we said, who's designing these toilets? Because we've done this project. And they said, no one, architects don't want to be involved with this. So we said, this is really important for the city. So we, on a voluntary basis, got involved with them and began researching where they had to build the toilets. We looked at statistics, and it's incredible what we call slums or the informal city or whatever you might want. There are going to be 3 billion people in 2050 who are going to live in this is even if we do things about it. This is just the natural trajectory of things in the world. Is going to be this kind of situation. So how can we say that we are not looking at these sort of situations? And historically, it's been about denial, eradication, tolerance, improvement. I think we have to shift the narrative to anticipation. We have to anticipate what we can do. We have to anticipate people are going to come in. They're going to live in temporary accommodation. How can we bring sanitation? What can we do? This child comes out of Dharavi. He is intact, white shirt, white socks, going to school, but he has no toilet to use. And so this is a fundamental problem. Design can only matter if we can engage ourselves in these sort of issues, and this is the mainstream that I'm talking about. If you look at the statistics, the UN Development Report says there's one toilet for 1,440 people in Mumbai. It's mind-boggling. The Spark, which is the NGO, says it's 1:800. The Bombay Municipal Corporation says it's 1 to 148. The target of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, 1:50. They're not even ambitious enough to say 1:4 or 6. So it's a huge problem. I mean, you're never going to have families that will have a toilet. For the next 10 decades, we'll be sharing toilets with at least 6 families if the BMC can meet its target. So it's a massive problem. And what happens in these toilets? They disregard. Everybody, defecates around the toilet, never in the toilet. And there are 2 fundamental problems. One is it's not seen as a community asset. And the second is the contractors or people who run it save on electricity and they take the bulbs off because it increases their profit marginally, but they do that. So women and children can't use these toilets. And that is a massive problem. So we came up with a prototype, which was a stacked toilet for women and children above, so they had the privacy, men below. We used the green wall as a way to change the image of the toilet so that people would pluck flowers maybe from this. And on top of the toilet, what we did was we put the caretaker's room. So the lowest caste person gets the penthouse in the slum. And to that, we attached a community center. And then I went to one of my clients who I did a beautiful farmhouse for. And over tea, I had him so guilt-ridden that he gave me money for solar panels for 10 toilets. So we put solar panels. And the solar panels takes the toilets off the grid, which means by taking it off the grid, the women, children can use it much more easily, so it becomes a sort of community place. Anyway, this was the idea. And then we started proposing them. This was built, but the government stopped it at the plinth because they are afraid that by building almost an iconic building in comparison, the slum will be legitimized. But they have imaginations of removing the slum and doing concrete buildings. But, you know, it's been 5 years and they haven't moved on it. And so this is a catch-22. This is the politics of this. So we did 8 projects where we showed what can happen, and none of them went beyond the plinth level. The moment they realized that there was something happening, they stopped it. So we went to a remote slum. I told Sheila, let's go to somewhere they'll never even go to check. And we actually built one, and it got built. And it got used. Children loved it. There's just bamboo slats. They would study there. That's what the government has been building for 10 years to relocate them, but hasn't managed to do that. And it became a space that really became a lookout spot. The solar panels were put. It was all working beautifully for about 4 months. And that's what it looked like. And that's an image that I took recently, where what the government did was restore that old toilet in front, which has failed, and this has been abandoned. And the reason it got abandoned, I can talk about this at length, but I don't want to, were 2 or 3 reasons. One is I think the NGO we were working with didn't have enough roots. We made a mistake of going out so remotely where they didn't really engage the community. They couldn't engage the community. They didn't know how to engage the community, perhaps. But the other thing that happened was the menfolk of the slums found that this was the best spot to watch TV, cricket matches, and drink. So it became the club for the men, and they excluded everybody else. And so it was a complete failure. So you learn from these failures, and somebody described architecture as being, an architect as being someone who has to ride an elephant, like a mahout. Every once in a while, they get thrown off the elephant. Sometimes the elephant tramples them. Sometimes they survive the trampling by, you know, rolling between the legs, and they climb on the elephant. And so that's what the stage we are at right now. We're trying to get back on the elephant, and we hope we can do something with this. And this is the last project I'm going to show you, and that's my client. Those are my clients, the elephant and the mahout. This is a project for the government of Rajasthan outside Jaipur. It is a low-cost, very low-cost housing scheme for 100 elephants and their mahouts. The mahouts are all Muslims in a right-wing Hindu state, so to speak. So they're not the best, they don't have the best access to many amenities. They earn about 5,000 rupees a month. And with tips, it goes up by another 2,000. It's about 7,000 or 8,000 if they're lucky, which is very low for all of you who live here. You know how difficult it is. And the government allocates 400 square feet for them. And that was the challenge. How do you create architecture out of that? And I realized, again, 2, 3, 4 years into the project, this has gone on for 7 or 8 years, it's gone through many governments and, you know, all of that, that you can't in every project privilege architecture. I think we shoot ourselves in the foot when we begin to fetishize architecture and forget people, and sometimes you have to change your priorities and create environments. And so this is what they do. They take tourists up, they use toxic paints, and you'll see a lot of them have spots as a result. That's what the government built for them. Mahouts live on top, elephants live below, which is a problem because the relationship between a mahout and an elephant is a very complex one. They sing them to sleep, they're the only ones who can control them. So to even spatially segregate them like this was a complete disaster. So we used landscape. We said this is a landscape project because we said elephants being in a desert climate is a mistake. It's a historical mistake because the Mughals brought them there. So elephants live in tropical climates. So how can we come closest to simulating the tropics in terms of water? Water is critical both for the mahout and the elephant to bond, but also for the health of the elephant. That's where the paint can be washed, etc. And so we made it a landscape project. And this is the site we were given, which was a site by the government, which is a site that the sand quarry contractors had actually excavated. So there were lots of big holes. And everyone said it's impossible, it's difficult, the government was avoiding the problem. But we saw that as an asset because we saw that we can actually harness the water. And we created a series of water bodies to do that, and local species to plant, etc. And then, of course, water, the metrics of water, how that's sort of distributed. And I'm happy to say that in 6 years of the project, we have doubled the requirement of the elephants for water in a desert climate by creating a landscape like this. So they need, I think, 1 million liters, or 20 million. So they need 10 million liters for the year. We've made it 20 million liters already, and only one phase of the project is done. And that's the site plan, where the houses were put which were on areas that wasn't needed for the water. We spent a lot of time designing the houses. We got away from the row house to create clusters, so there was intimacy, and how the 400 square feet could be expanded by courtyards. So we did a courtyard within a house, and then we did a shared courtyard for 3 houses. So community building became a big sort of aspect. And of course, we spent a lot of time on the architecture. That's the elephant, like in a garage. The elephant can't enter the main courtyard because children work there and play there. And we spent a lot of time on the architecture. And of course, the PWD perversely always subverts any good intentions of architecture. So we began to give up on it, and we said these houses will be transformed in 10 years when the project matures. That's what a site visit looked like, because elephants are also small, medium, large, extra large. So we had to design different rooms for different sizes. And the water was done, the holes were dug, the government fell, no one moved in there, but the elephants would yet come to bathe there. This is when, of course, government and construction people always build the houses first because the margins are there, the landscape doesn't feature in their specs. So the water happened by default, but because the government fell, no one touched it for 2 years, because governments never touch each other's projects for a while till they get credit for it. But that was to our advantage because the water sort of filled in there. And that was what it was like in 2007. That's the same hill in 3 years. That's what we did, and we transformed it. And now it's finally, they're taking it seriously. They're planting trees in the clusters. You can see the water bodies. You can see how many more trees there are. The bonding is very important. This is what they sort of do. They work very hard. And I think it was a competition, and most of my colleagues had fetishized architecture. I think by moving into landscape, I think we changed the debate on it, and it really is a very natural landscape. It's a project that's yet under construction. I would love to present it in 5 years when houses have changed and the landscape has really taken. But this is the moment that we designed it for, because the mahout and the elephant bathing is fundamental to the health of the elephant and their sort of well-being. And that's Amber Palace, the fort that you see in the background, so you know the distance from it. Natural species. Elephants can now, as they walk to work, have a snack, which they could never do before. As they do, and you can see the trees that we've planted, a lot of neem and many others. In 5 or 10 years, this will transform. The big sheds also are used to store hay for the elephants, so it insulates the houses in the process because we didn't have space to do that. And of course, there's a whole community that's built around it. Different people use clusters differently. We've created windows where the elephants can watch their keepers play in the courtyard. So they also feel part of sort of the larger community. Now the government is giving us more money to create the other water bodies, and the whole ambience is beginning to change. I think it's very interesting, mainly because there's a sense of community there, both between the elephants, the children, and everyone around them. I'm just going to take us literally 30 seconds to summarize some of these thoughts, which is, I think, as India in particular becomes increasingly global, the word that we all use, we have to be cautious as architects, as designers, as artists, about accepting that things are growing more alike because they begin to look more alike. Because when we engage with a deeper excavation of a site, of a place, places and contexts that we operate in, and understanding that draws on both the objective reality that we see easily, as well as the subjective perception of the site, which we have to excavate more intuitively, the differences actually emerge more strikingly than before, where differences were actually assured when things looked different. We were in a comfort zone there. This is a complex moment, and therefore excavation and more complex readings become important. So architects will have to therefore find more rigorous ways of defining the complex, emerging cultural fabric of multiple aspirations, the landscape of our mutinous Indian democracy. And more importantly, to see the cultural fabric as an ever-evolving landscape. We are not stuck. Identity is not, we don't find our identity, we construct our identity. And I think this proactiveness, I think Subodh said this very well, you shouldn't be afraid of your identity because we are constantly constructing our identity. We have to be aware of that. And I think culture is a dialogue between aspirations and sedimented traditions. So in these interpretations that we as designers make of a place or culture, ideas of the future, as much as those of the past, have to be embedded and nurtured. And I think in this highly pluralistic environment that we work with in India, we need mechanisms of planning, design, of art, that continually negotiate between the differences. Architecture is the sole instrument for placemaking, and the temporality that creates the condition of habitation and celebration, the state and the market, the empowered and the poor, rather than allowing one entity to prevail. This we have to be really careful about, because I think we have to see the various differences as being simultaneously valid. The challenge is then how to go beyond their polarized binaries and sort of create a third space, a space that dissolves these binaries. It's in terms of social questions, economic questions, and otherwise. And I think that's truly the space in which we'll be able to engage, at least from my perspective, with architecture and society more meaningfully. And I think that is critical if we have to make design matter. Thank you very much.